talk a little bit about the factors that directly contribute to corruption. And regulations and authorizations are definitely one of the big ones. And there's two reasons, three reasons actually. The first is that sometimes regulations are really hard to understand. And any of you that ever worked in government can have had experience with this. I know, like when I was in the Army, I would read HR regulations because that pertained to my job. And sometimes you look at it like, I don't know. I don't exactly know what this means. And so, you ask somebody who understands it better, has had more experience in the particular interpretations of some words or phrasing in a regulation to kind of help you get you through. And that's more of a cooperative thing. But imagine that you're in a country where corruption is pretty rampant and the layperson can't understand these regulations. So that gives a particular civil servant a huge amount of power. And they can use that power to extort money or privileges or favors from somebody outside the government. They can say, well, the regulation says that in order to get this particular license from me, you've got to pay me this amount of money. And you look at the regulation as a layperson, I don't know, but I guess he or she probably knows because this is what they do all day, so I guess I have to do it. And then it doesn't look like I have an appeal either because that's the way they've interpreted the regulation for me. Again, so regulations can be kind of opaque. It can be kind of hard to understand. So that can contribute to corruption. And of course, when you've got a situation where like only one or two people can grant certain licenses or privileges, that can also contribute to the rise in corruption because you don't have any mechanism of appealing or getting a second opinion. If Bob the civil servant says you've got to do it, then you got to do it if you want to get your license. I've heard in India they have something called a license Raj. These are individuals who have access to permits and things that you need to do business. And you got to go through the license Raj or you don't get to do business. So that gives that person a tremendous amount of power to extort other people. And of course, I understand that in Spain they have what they call facilitators, right? And a facilitator basically is somebody who may be a retired civil servant or doesn't work for the government but has good connections in the government. And so, like, let's say you need some just basic administrative action. What you'll do is you'll meet with them, you pay them the bribe, and of course maybe they fill out the paperwork or whatever, and then they go to the government office and then actually make sure that it gets done for you, make sure that you get some sort of faster treatment or better service or whatever it is. So again, that's a facilitator can also be considered a form of corruption that pertains to regular regulations and these kinds of authorizations. Now, taxation is also a big one. That can also greatly contribute to corruption, especially with taxation law. And in the U.S., taxation is pretty darn complicated for the average person, right? Rich people, of course, have accountants that do this full time for them, but for the average person, it's tough. And by the way, we've got pretty transparent regulations here in the U.S. So in a lot of countries where the laws are difficult to understand, that can make it difficult for the average taxpayer to comply with them, which can lead to a rise in corruption. Furthermore, if the taxpayer needs to have regular contact with the tax collector, that can also increase the occurrence of corruption because they start to have this relationship and they can kind of be made to feel vulnerable to the tax collector. Of course, if tax administrators have very low salaries, then of course that can also contribute to corruption because they kind of get desperate, the tax collectors. Of course, if it's easy to hide corruption on the part of the tax collector, or if you report a tax collector but you know that there'll be no action or no penalty for corruption with regards to tax administration, that's going to contribute to it too. Again, as I mentioned before, if tax procedures are not all that transparent, that can contribute to corruption. If the tax collector has almost sole discretion with very little accountability with regards to things like auditing, tax incentive, determining tax liabilities, litigations, and so on, that gives that tax administrator a great degree of power, and therefore that can contribute to the rise of corruption in a tax system. And if the state just doesn't pretty much lets the tax collector do whatever they want, that's going to contribute to corruption within a tax system as well. Now, of course, spending decisions are a huge contributor to corruption, especially with public expenditures. Investment projects, are full of opportunities for the kind of spawning of corruption, if it were, especially public investment projects. When I lived in Ukraine, they told me this joke. No offense to my Ukrainian friends, this was a joke that I understood was pretty well known. But there's a government administrator that wants to build a highway from Kiev to Odessa, and so he puts out the bids, and he asks a French company. He says, "How much to build the road?" And they said, "Hey, we'll build this road for you for $2 billion. And he says, $2 billion? Wow, why so high? And they said, well, we're a French company. We have very high labor costs, but it's a very quality road. It'll last forever. You're going to love the road. Okay. He asked a Turkish company. He says, how much to build the road? And he says, $1 billion. He said, $1 billion? Why so low? And they said, well, we have low labor costs in Turkey. And, that's just why it's so much cheaper. Okay. And then he asked the Ukrainian contractor. He says, how much to build the road? They said, $3 billion. He said, $3 billion? Why so much? And he says, $1 billion for you, $1 billion for me, and $1 billion to pay the Turkish company to do the work. So I guess the point that I'm making is, especially when government administrators have a lot of discretion with regards to public investment projects, that can contribute to corruption. And I'm not just picking on countries like Ukraine. It has even happened in the United States government, where you've got government contractors who are bribing all sorts of different kinds of officials when it comes to investment decisions. And that ties me into the next one with regards to procurement spending. When governments have to make purchases, just like investment projects, building roads, construction projects, etc., procurement spending also has a huge amount of room for the incidence of corruption. And they make a joke in the Army about the $500 hammer and the $300 toilet seat. Again, I'm not saying that's necessarily corruption, but it probably has something to do with it. And I remember a few years ago there was some sort of I think he was a defense contractor from Singapore, and he was bribing admirals, and I believe it was the U.S. Navy. He was bribing admirals to make sure that their ships went into certain ports when this defense contractor dictated, and they had to use his supplies and everything to restock and refuel the ships. And of course, in exchange, they were being offered positions in a firm. Of course, prostitutes were involved, cash payments, fancy dinners, all this kind of stuff. So again, I don't want you to think that I'm picking on the development world. It's really a question of power relationships and money. And of course, extra budgetary accounts exist in many, many countries. And these are things like pension funds and road funds, and et cetera. Some of them also are set up to help pay for political parties and things like this. But these extra budgetary accounts typically don't have a lot of supervision in where that money goes. And of course, that can also contribute to the rise of governmental corruption. Now, you also have to deal with, sometimes there are goods and services that are provided at below market prices. Most countries have subsidies available on certain goods for some reason, right? Well, and again, we typically think in the U.S. of things like agriculture, but it can also be things like credit, electricity, any sort of utilities, public housing, certain ration goods. And so this can also lead to a rise in corruption. Wouldn't it be nice to have like a rent ceiling in a very expensive city? Well, maybe you could bribe a local official to make sure that you paid your housing fee at a below market cost. These are like kickbacks. And of course, rationing is something that happens in many countries, particularly during war times. And of course, this can also lead to the rise of corruption. Imagine if everybody only gets a kilogram of meat a day, but you could probably make some bribes and get 2 kilograms of meat per day if you wanted to. Okay. There's other discretionary kinds of decisions that can also lead to the rise of corruption, such as when certain civil servants have kind of sole discretion over the use of land, like zoning decisions. Let's face it, property that's zoned commercial is typically more valuable than property that is zoned residential. So again, having a civil servant in your pocket to help you out with that is important. I used to hear stories about tobacco farmers would also bribe the surveyors so that they could grow more tobacco on their land. That's a good example of zoning laws. Decisions regarding the use of government-owned land. For example, imagine that you're a company and you get access to a federally owned forest for the use of logging privileges, cutting down trees. Well, that's a pretty valuable resource. Or imagine that you could get access to public lands for oil drilling. Okay, that can also lead to the rise of corruption. Of course, anytime that you have countries that have gone through privatization, so for example, like a utility might be a publicly owned thing and then it becomes a privately owned entity, this kind of process of privatization of public assets is rife with corruption, or can at least contribute to corruption. And then another problem that you also have is a lot of political parties need to be financed. And this need to finance activities can lead to forms of election improprieties that can be interpreted as acts of corruption. So these are the direct causes of corruption, or at least some examples of them. I hope you found this video useful. If you like it, give me a thumbs up, subscribe. If you have any comments, you can post them down below and I'll respond to them. And I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next video.